I'm Nigel Sarbutts. Some people may know me from my business, the PR Cavalry, the freelancer matchmaking platform, but I'm here wearing my hat as my practice is structured mediation, which is a relatively new venture for me. I trained and qualified to become a civil and workplace mediator last year. And I'm now the official mediation partner of the PRCA. The thought occurred to me that in an issue, I'm going to limit my comments to issues management rather than incident response in the kind of blue light sense, or of an industrial catastrophe or something like that, because this is around where two parties, perhaps the client or the employer of the people watching this clip, are in a position in an adversarial position with an opponent, a stakeholder who has a problem with them. And where you have two parties in that adversarial position, that's where mediation can have a role. And it struck me that comms, and I used to be a practitioner, and I've done quite a lot of incident management. I've done quite a lot of issues management over time. It struck me that comms is, and don't take this the wrong way, people, is a kind of second order activity. It's a second tier activity in the sense that its job is to deal with the impact, the reputational impact of an incident, or the reputational impact of an opponent attacking you through whatever means. Whereas a first order activity would deal with the issue itself. And I think that's an important distinction. And that mediation is a way for comms to bridge that gap, to become part of the response, which actually minimizes the issue rather than simply deals with the reputational impacts of that issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That comms is, in an advisory role, and hopefully in a strategic advisory role. And we all know where clients or organizations have kind of turned to the comms function and said, just make it go away, make the problem go away. I don't want to deal with this. And that's the worst kind of, brief to have. But at its best, comms is, how do we work toward communicating a change in the organization that we're going to make in response to this issue. And that mediation is a kind of middle ground there, where it can say, well, comms can have a role not only in communicating, but in actually making the problem smaller, of actually, in that phrase, being in the room where it happens. Is that, mediation is about making a problem smaller, or even resolving a problem entirely. And that it seems that mediation can be part of the comms toolkit in an incident, or in dealing with an issue, not an incident. And it's a way of going upstream, but it's essentially around trying to make an issue smaller than it currently is, rather than simply dealing with the backwash or the impact of that issue in the public domain.
And some people will sort of almost associate mediation with an internal kind of issue, where you may have internal disputes in an organization. But is this as relevant externally as it would be internally?
Yes, I mean, I've worked with mediators who have mediated gang warfare, rival gangs, so that's where, you have two organizations that are in opposition that may end up potentially going legal, but certainly they are two, bodies external to each other that have a problem. And that might be a commercial dispute. It could be a dispute over planning commission, something, I know you're active in personally. And there you have people that are not in the same organization, and they are conducting themselves and are, operating in the public domain in opposition. So yeah, mediation can work in the workplace between colleagues who are, not working properly together. There's friction between colleagues, and that's workplace mediation. I'm talking about, civil commercial mediation, which is where two organizations are in conflict. Well, I think, firstly, it's understand what mediation is and what it isn't. A mediator is there to create an environment where two parties in dispute can get together face to face, Zoom, whatever method it is, and can in private, and it has to be in private, totally in confidence and without prejudice in that legal sense, that anything said in a mediation cannot be used in a subsequent legal action. And that it's a space for two parties who are in dispute to come together, and if they are willing, or if they believe that there is a way forward that can be agreed between them, that they can explore ways that they can make a problem smaller, they can take some issues off the table. But what it isn't is a mediator is not a judge. The mediator doesn't say, you are more right than they are. And a mediator doesn't advise. It doesn't say, well, why don't you offer this to the other side? What the mediator does is that they explore and help both parties, partially through joint meeting, but mostly in private session, to think about how they could shape an offer to the other side, and also think about how that offer may be received. Because it's one thing to say, well, okay, we'll bend this way and we'll make this offer in order to try and reach a compromise or to take something off the table that's currently in dispute. But, the other side are going to react to that. So you've got to think about, well, how are they going to react? So it's a safe space. It's a neutral space where things that are said, perhaps, when your blood is high in public, or, angry statements made, are left at the door. And that it's a way for that neutral space to grow, where perhaps a little bit of trust between adversaries can develop. And certainly it's a way that for two parties in dispute can communicate in a different way. And no doubt a lot of people watching this, they are drafting statements to go into the public domain. And, those serve a purpose. Of course they do. But sometimes it's better to communicate privately, off the record, behind closed doors, in a way that can't be disclosed to anybody else outside. And that's where a little bit of trust can grow, and that people can understand the other's position in a way that is difficult to do through what you read in the media. So it's, at its heart, it's a very structured process of shuttling between two parties. You have joint sessions where both parties sit across the table and say, well, this is my position, this is what I want. And then in private, you work with both parties individually to say, okay, that's your position. Where do you want to be? If this can be solved, if this problem can be solved in a way that you think is fair, what would that release you to do? What would it free you up to do if you can put this into the rearview mirror? And that's quite a powerful thing to think about, because in that adversarial position, you want to grind the other guy into the ground, you want to win 100%, but it's very rare to win 100% of anything. And what you do in mediation is you think about, well, if we can get to a solution, then that unlocks other things for us. It just unlocks a lot of management time that's currently being drawn into this, and that would then enable us to do the things that we really want to do. So you start with two parties who hold positions, and then bit by bit you migrate towards, well, what do you want to achieve at the end of this, and how do you get from where you are now, that position you hold in public that you've communicated to the other side, to what you want out of this. And that's the journey that mediation takes you on. And this can be conducted in a couple of hours. A mediation, a fairly substantial mediation probably will take a day. But it's a very rapid way of identifying what's important to both sides and tabling solutions that work for both sides. And then at the end of it, hopefully, if you've agreed terms, then those are captured, possibly with the help of a lawyer that actually sets it in stone that you've both agreed to do this, you've both agreed to do that by such and such a date, and that is captured and agreed in a way that is binding on both sides. I think that there's probably 3 or 4 things to think about. Is firstly, are you genuine? If you are going into a mediation just to go through the motions, or even worse, to try and discover something about the other side, then you are wasting your time. Mediation has to be between 2 parties that at least can genuinely entertain the possibility of a solution being agreed in private. And if you're not willing to do that, then don't mediate. If you're just going to say, I don't care, arms folded, take me to court, then you shouldn't mediate. And just on that point, if a dispute does get to literally going to court, the courts in a civil dispute will almost certainly insist that you mediate anyway before you go to court, because they will ask you, have you tried to solve this already? Have you tried to find a middle ground between you? And if you say, well, no, I refuse to mediate, and then you lose, then you're going to find that the costs order against you, and the judge is not going to look kindly on you. So you have to be genuine in wanting to mediate. You have to believe that a mediation can take you somewhere. Second point is only decision makers in the room. Only people who have the authority to make an offer should be involved in the mediation. Nobody else should be in the room. If those people, if the true decision maker, the CEO or whatever, who has to sign something off, they should at least be at the end of a phone and available throughout the period of the mediation, if they can't physically be in the room or take part in the Zoom. But there should be no bag carriers, nobody that doesn't have the authority to say, well, why don't we offer this? You've got to, thirdly, focus on what you want to come out of this. What is your goal? You have a position that you've made public, that that we believe this, this, and this. But if a solution can be found, what does that release you to do? And you've got to think about the steps that you need to go from where you are now, that position that's in public, to what you are prepared to accept. And there will be some steps that mentally you should be prepared to make to get there. Obviously, you don't reveal that at the beginning. And then workshop what those steps are, but workshop how you think the other side will respond to those. Because if it's one thing to say, well, okay, well, what if I do this? And if the other side says, just not interested, I don't care about that, that is of no value to me, then you've wasted a card to play. So you should workshop how you think the other side is going to respond to what you're about to offer. And then, well, what does that mean for your offer? Should you amend it at the first stage? Or if you think they're going to make a counter offer, what will then you offer back? And what mediation is doing is narrowing a gap bit by bit by bit over the course of the mediation, between, over the course of a number of hours or a day, where hopefully at the beginning of the thing, if there are 6 issues in dispute, generally, hopefully you can knock out number 6, number 5, number 4 fairly quickly. And of course, in any negotiation, it's the last 1, 2, 3 points that are the sticking points. And so if you can knock out those smaller ones fairly early on and just focus on where you want to go next, the real core issue of a dispute, then that's what you need to work on, and how are you going to respond to a counter offer. So there are 4 things there. Be genuine, only decision makers, focus on what you want out of out of this and accept the fact that that will require you to make some movement in your position, and workshop how the other side will respond.
And just a kind of thought is, do you look at, when things happen that are publicised and where there's open kind of issue dispute and think, oh, that could have been sorted out. Now you've been trained in kind of doing this.
Well, I had to laugh a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember whether it was Secretary of State or Pete Hegseth or something like that. Had issued a statement to say the one thing left on the table between us and Iran is opening the Strait of Hormuz. I was thinking, yeah, that is the point, isn't it? That's saying there's only one thing left on the table to negotiate, and that's the thing. Seems like So yeah, I mean, I do look at issues from a sort of point of view of how could that have been resolved maybe a little bit quicker, and very often disputes start with a failure of communication.
Mm.
If you look back at any time that you've been in dispute, maybe with a colleague or with a supplier or a client or whatever it is, you can probably trace it back to a point where something was said in an email or a conversation, and it changed the weather, it changed the temperature of the relationship. And then bit by bit, the two parties kind of just seem to, and quite soon you think, this gap is really quite a problem. We are now in dispute. We haven't just kind of got our wires crossed. We're actually in dispute now. But very often it starts with a failure of communication. And, and I've been in mediations where you've got two people that are, really, they come into the room, with their fists, clenched, the body language is like that. And one person saying, do you know what? I'm sorry. I didn't know that what I said made you feel like that. I had no idea that what I did that day would have that impact on our relationship. And, obviously if I could and just that kind of saying sorry in private can't be held against you. It's an honest thing to say. Or even literally being in the same room and looking across a table at somebody that you've been firing angry emails at each other, or maybe in a reputational issue, you've been firing angry statements through the media at each other. And then across the table, you realize they haven't got two heads, that they're human like anybody else. They have legitimate concerns, and being able to say, I think I understand how you feel. Let me just, expand on that point. It can be an incredible unlocking moment when, two sides that, kind of have this, they've put their suit of armor on to be adversaries, and they realize that, perhaps there is quite a lot of common ground. There still could be very substantial points of difference between them, but, let's deal with them, not thinking of the other side as somehow deficient in the way they're going about it, but thinking about them as people that have misunderstood your intentions, your statements, and have adopted a stance. And just doing that can be incredibly powerful. Obviously choose your mediator well. Look for somebody who can understand the process of communications. I'm about to say that, but and has got the gravitas to be able to sit down with a total stranger, work through some details pretty quickly, and get to the heart of what is really driving the source of anger, or driving the source of grievance between the two.